A wild mountain man pulled her from a flooded river, unaware that she carried the key to his locked-shut heart. She thought only one thing as the water took her. Let the boy live. The wind tore through the canyon, a merciless howl that promised only destruction. Jedediah had been checking his trap lines when the sky turned the color of a deep bruise, the air growing heavy and still. He knew that stillness. It was the breath the world took before it screamed. He had been heading back to his cabin, a solitary structure of hewn logs perched on a high bluff, when the roar began. It wasn't the wind anymore. It was the river, swollen and furious, a brown torrent churning with uprooted trees and the debris of a world coming undone. He stood on the ridge, his weathered face impassive, watching the destruction with the detached calm of a man who had already lost everything there was to lose. Then he saw it, a flicker of movement that wasn't a log, something desperate, clinging to a splintered piece of a wagon wheel. He squinted, his eyes that had seen everything narrowing against the spray. It was a woman, her dark dress plastered to her face a pale smudge of terror, and clutched to her chest, a small, still bundle, a child. His heart, a thing he thought long dead and buried, gave a painful, violent lurch. He didn't think. He simply moved. The memory of a different storm, a different helplessness, spurred his legs faster than conscious thought. He scrambled down the slick rock face, his boots finding purchase where there should have been none. The water was a biting, liquid cold, its power absolute. He fought the current, his entire being focused on that single point of life in the maelstrom. He reached her just as her grip was failing, her eyes closing in exhaustion. He grabbed her arm, his fingers like iron bands. She flinched, even in her delirium. He ignored it, pulling her and the child toward him, turning his broad back to the main force of the current. He was a rock, an anchor in the chaos. He dragged them from the water, their dead weight a testament to their ordeal. On the muddy bank, she coughed, sputtering water and river silt. The child, a small boy, began to wail, a thin, reedy sound that was nearly swallowed by the storm. Jedediah stripped the heavy wool blanket from his saddle, wrapping it around them both. He said nothing. There were no words for this. There were only the facts of survival. The biting wind, the slate evening sky, and the three of them breathing. He lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. She was rigid with fear. He carried her toward the only shelter for miles. His home. He didn't know it yet, but his first true home was right in front of him. She awoke to the sound of silence. Not the roaring, water-filled chaos of her last memory, but a deep, profound quiet, punctuated only by the soft crackle of a fire. Her body ached with 1,000 bruises, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that felt permanent. She was dry. She was warm. A thick, scratchy wool blanket was tucked around her, smelling faintly of pine smoke and horse. Her son, Samuel, was asleep beside her on the narrow cot, his small chest rising and falling in a steady, reassuring rhythm. He was also dry, wrapped in a smaller blanket. For a moment, a wave of impossible gratitude washed over her. Then came the fear, cold and sharp. She sat up, her head swimming. The cabin was small, a single room built of dark, sturdy logs. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its flames casting a smoky, dancing light. There was a rough-hewn table, a single chair, and shelves holding tin plates and provisions. It was a man's space, stark and functional. And the man was there. He sat in the chair by the fire, his back to her, mending a piece of leather harness with deliberate, unhurried movements. He was massive, his shoulders broad enough to block out most of the firelight. He hadn't seemed to notice she was awake. Alara held her breath, every muscle tense. She remembered his face from the river, weathered, grim, with eyes that seemed to hold the vast, lonely wilderness within them. He had saved them, yes, but what did he want in return? Her life had taught her that nothing was given freely. Every act of kindness was a debt, and the payment was always higher than one could afford. She clutched Samuel closer, her knuckles white. The man paused in his work. He set the harness down and rose, his movements slow, unobtrusive. He didn't turn to look at her. He walked to the stove, poured water from a kettle into a tin cup, and placed it on the edge of the table near the cot. He still did not look at her. Then he picked up his rifle, pulled on a heavy coat, and walked to the wooden door. He paused with his hand on the latch. "There's stew in the pot," he said, his voice a low rumble rough from disuse. The boy should eat. Then he was gone, the door closing with a quiet click, leaving her alone in the charged silence. She stared at the cup of steaming water, then at the door. He had saved her. He had fed her fire. And then he had left. It made no sense. Suspicion warred with a desperate, trembling hope. She stayed. The days that followed fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm. He was a ghost in his own home, a silent provider. Alara would wake in the pre-dawn chill to find a neat stack of firewood by the hearth and a bucket of fresh water by the door. He would be gone before the sun crested the mountains, off to check his traps or hunt. He would return at dusk, a brace of rabbits or a grouse slung over his shoulder, his face etched with the weariness of the wild. He would nod to her, a short, almost imperceptible dip of his chin, and she would nod back. They never spoke. The cabin was too small for such a vast silence, yet they filled it every day. He would eat his portion of stew or roasted meat at the table, his gaze fixed on the fire. She and Samuel would eat by the cot. Their world shrunk to the space of a single wool blanket. She felt like a trespasser, a stray creature he had taken in out of some gruff, incomprehensible pity. She did what she could to earn her keep. She swept the rough floorboards with a makeshift broom. She mended the tear in Samuel's shirt with a needle and thread she found in a small wooden box. She kept the stew pot full, adding wild onions and herbs she found growing near the cabin. She worked with a quiet dignity, her movements efficient and contained. She did not want to be a burden. More than that, she did not want to give him any reason to think she was weak or to send her away. Where would they go? The thought was a cold knot in her stomach. Sometimes, she would watch him when he thought she wasn't looking. She saw the way his hands, though calloused and powerful, could be gentle as he cleaned a rifle or sharpened a knife. She saw the deep lines of sorrow around his eyes when he stared into the fire, lost in a place she couldn't see. He was a man made of concealed pain. One evening, Samuel, growing bolder, toddled toward the man, holding out a smooth river stone. The man froze. He looked down at the boy, his expression unreadable. For a long, tense moment he did nothing. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. Then, slowly, he reached out and his large, rough fingers closed around the small stone. He gave a single, slow nod to the boy. Samuel beamed and toddled back to his mother. The man did not look at Alara. He simply slipped the stone into his pocket. A tiny crack had appeared in the wall of silence. A single stone. It was almost enough. He chopped wood deep into the night, as if splitting his guilt into pieces. Having them here, this woman and her boy, was a constant, aching reminder of what he had lost. The cabin, once a refuge of numb solitude, was now filled with the soft sounds of their existence. The child's quiet breathing, the rustle of the blanket as she shifted in her sleep, the almost imperceptible scent of soap from the lye she had used to wash their clothes. It was a torment he had not asked for, yet one he had brought upon himself. He had acted on an impulse he didn't understand, a ghost memory of another frantic rescue that had failed. Now, their presence was a raw, living wound in his carefully constructed emptiness. He found himself noticing things. The thinness of her worn-down shoes, the soles nearly gone. The way she gave the largest portion of every meal to the boy, her own plate sparse. The way she flinched if he moved too quickly. He began to leave things for her, small interventions performed in secret. One morning, after he had left, she found the boy's shoes sitting by the hearth. They were not the same. He had taken the old, ruined leather and painstakingly replaced the soles with thick, sturdy hide, stitched with sinew so fine it was nearly invisible. They were strong now, reliable. She ran a trembling finger over the stitches. She had not asked. He had not offered. It had simply been done. Another day, a small parcel wrapped in oilcloth appeared on the table. Inside was a bar of scented soap and a comb carved from bone. Luxuries she hadn't known in years. She looked toward the mountains where he hunted, her heart a confusion of fear and a fragile, growing warmth. The greatest secret was for the boy. Jedediah had seen him playing with twigs and stones, his imagination filling the empty spaces. In the long, quiet evenings, after she and the boy were asleep, Jedediah would sit by the dying embers of the fire and carve. He worked a piece of seasoned pine, his knife moving with a slow, deliberate grace. He wasn't carving a tool or a weapon. He was carving the shape of a memory. A few days later, Samuel discovered it tucked into the woodpile. It was a small, perfectly formed bird, its wings half spread as if about to take flight. Its surface was sanded smooth as glass. The boy gasped, his eyes wide with wonder. He clutched the wooden bird to his chest and did not let it go for the rest of the day. Alara watched him, and she knew. This silent, formidable man was not just letting them stay. He was, in his own quiet, unobtrusive way, trying to care for them. The thought was more terrifying than any threat. It felt dangerously like hope. The sky, which had been a clear, crisp blue for days, began to curdle. A deep fog rolled in from the peaks, thick and damp, swallowing the landscape. A biting wind rose with it, carrying the first stinging crystals of ice. Another storm was coming, this one colder, meaner. Jedediah secured the cabin, banking the fire high and checking the chinking between the logs. He felt the shift in the air in his bones, a familiar dread. It was in weather like this that his world had ended before. Inside, the fragile peace they had built began to fray. Samuel, who had been recovering well, grew listless. By evening, a flush had appeared on his cheeks, and his breathing was shallow and ragged. Alara felt his forehead. It was burning with fever. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She bathed his face with a cool cloth, whispering reassurances that sounded hollow in the small, tense room. The boy's fever was a consequence of the river, a delayed payment for their survival. The wind howled outside, rattling the door in its frame, a mirror of the storm inside her heart. She was alone, trapped, her child growing worse with every passing hour. Jedediah watched from his chair, his face a rigid mask. He saw the terror in her eyes, the trembling of her hands. He saw it all, and it was like looking into a mirror of his own past failure. He remembered his own daughter, Lily, her breath catching in her small chest, the uselessness of his own large hands. He had frozen then. He would not freeze now. He rose. Alara flinched, pulling the boy closer, her eyes wide and defensive. "He needs a sweat," Jedediah said, his voice quiet but firm. It was the first full sentence he had spoken to her in weeks. The fever must break. He moved with a newfound purpose, his earlier hesitation gone, replaced by a grim competence. He stoked the fire until it roared, making the small cabin intensely hot. He boiled water on the stove, adding handfuls of dried herbs from a pouch on the shelf, yarrow and elderflower. The air grew thick with their pungent, medicinal scent. He brought her the steaming cup. "Make him drink this." All of it. She looked from the cup to his face. For the first time, she saw not a threat, but a desperate, shared humanity. The sorrow in his eyes was not just for her. It was for a grief of his own. She nodded, her trust a tiny, unsteady seed. Together, in the suffocating heat of the cabin, while the storm raged outside, they worked to save the boy. He held Samuel, his large hands surprisingly gentle, while she coaxed the bitter tea past his lips. They were no longer two separate, silent beings. They were a single unit fighting against the encroaching dark. The fever broke near dawn. One moment, Samuel's skin was dry and burning. The next, a sheen of sweat covered his small body. His breathing deepened, evening out into the peaceful rhythm of sleep. Alara collapsed onto the edge of the cot, limp with relief, her tears falling silently onto the wool blanket. Jedediah stood by the window, looking out at the world encased in a fresh layer of frost, his shoulders heavy. The shared crisis had forged a new kind of silence between them, not one of distrust, but of shared experience. It was fragile, but it was real. For 2 days, a quiet calm settled over the homestead. Samuel recovered quickly, his childish energy returning. He would follow Jedediah around the cabin, chattering away, holding up his wooden bird for inspection. Jedediah would respond with his customary nod. But a subtle change had occurred. A softness had entered his eyes when he looked at the boy. He had begun to carve another figure, a small, stocky bear. The routine of survival continued, but it was different now. They ate at the table together. Sometimes Elara would ask him a simple question about the woods, and he would answer in his low, rumbling voice. Then, on the 3rd day, the outside world intruded. Jedediah was splitting wood when he saw him, a rider on a fine, dark horse, picking his way up the trail toward the bluff. The man was dressed in town clothes, a stark black coat and hat that seemed out of place in the rugged landscape. Jedediah's hand tightened on the axe handle. Strangers were rare, unwelcome. He watched as the rider drew closer, a feeling of deep unease settling in his gut. Inside, Elara was humming softly as she stirred a pot of stew. Samuel was napping on the cot. She glanced out the small window, catching a glimpse of the approaching figure. She froze. The ladle fell from her hand, clattering onto the floorboards. The color drained from her face, replaced by a stark, primal terror. Every muscle in her body went rigid. The past she had run from, the nightmare she had prayed every single day to escape, had found her. It was him, Silas Blackwood, her husband. Jedediah saw the change in her from the doorway. He saw her flattened against the wall, her hand over her mouth as if to stifle a scream. He saw the look in her eyes, the look of a cornered animal that knows the trap has sprung. He didn't need to ask. He knew. He set the axe down deliberately, calmly, and turned to face the approaching rider. The quiet of his mountain had been shattered. Silas Blackwood dismounted with an air of arrogant ownership, his polished boots sinking into the muddy earth as if it offended him. He was a handsome man in a cruel way, his smile thin and unpleasant. He surveyed the humble cabin with a dismissive sneer, his gaze finally landing on Jedediah. "Quite the hovel you've got here, mountain man," he said, his voice smooth and mocking. "I'm looking for my property. A woman. A boy. She has a foolish notion of freedom." He gestured toward the cabin. "I'm told she came this way." Before Jedediah could answer, Elara appeared in the doorway. She stood there, trembling but upright, her face a pale mask of exhausted defiance. Samuel, woken by the voices, peeked out from behind her skirts, clutching her leg. "Silas," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. Blackwood's smile widened. "Ah, there you are, my dear. Did you enjoy your little adventure? It's over now. Get the boy. We're leaving." He took a step forward, his hand outstretched. Elara flinched back, pulling Samuel with her. "No," she said, the words small but solid. "We're not going back." Blackwood laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Don't be ridiculous. You belong to me. The law says so." He looked at Jedediah. "This is a private matter between a man and his wife. Stay out of it." He lunged for her arm. In that instant, Jedediah moved. He didn't rush. He simply stepped between them, a silent, immovable wall of weathered buckskin and solid muscle. He didn't raise his voice or his fists. He just stood there, his presence more intimidating than any threat. Blackwood stopped, surprised by the sudden obstacle. "Get out of my way, you backwoods clod," he snarled. Jedediah remained silent. He looked at Elara, saw the raw terror in her eyes, and then turned his gaze back to Blackwood. The look in his eyes was flat, cold, and utterly final. It was the look of a man who had nothing left to lose and had finally found something worth defending. "She's not property," Jedediah said, his voice low and steady, carrying over the biting wind. "And she's not with you." Blackwood bristled, his face turning red with fury. "And who are you to say? Her keeper." "She's with me," Jedediah stated, the words simple and absolute. He took a small step, planting himself more firmly, shielding her completely. Not bought, chosen. Now get off this land. The two men faced each other, a clash of two different worlds. One of loud, hollow claims, the other of quiet, unshakable conviction. Blackwood, for all his bluster, was a bully. He stared into Jedediah's dead calm eyes and saw no fear, no hesitation. He saw a boundary he could not cross. Cursing under his breath, he turned, remounted his fine horse, and rode away, his retreat a cloud of impotent fury. Elara watched him go, the strength draining out of her. She leaned against the doorframe, and for the first time since he'd pulled her from the river, she cried. Not from fear, but from relief. Jedediah stayed where he was, a silent guardian, until the rider was just a speck in the vast, dusty distance. He had spoken. He had acted. The world had changed. That evening the silence returned, but it was a different kind. It was the quiet after a storm, full of the weight of what had happened. The threat was gone, but the memory of it hung in the air. Jedediah sat on the small porch, cleaning his rifle with meticulous, rhythmic motions. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft orange. The wind whispered through the dry grass. Elara came out and sat on the top step, pulling a thin shawl around her weary shoulders. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The creak of the porch boards under her slight weight was the only sound. Finally, she broke the stillness. "He won't be back," she said, her voice soft and raw. "He's a coward. He only preys on those he thinks are weaker." She paused, then began to speak, the words spilling out in a quiet, broken torrent. She told him of her life with Silas, a life of gilded cruelty, of being a possession to be shown off and then locked away. She told him of the casual brutalities, the constant fear, and the final, desperate decision to flee with her son in the dead of night with nothing but the clothes on her back. She had been heading for a rumored distant cousin in the territories, a faint hope that had been washed away by the flood. She spoke until the words ran out, leaving only the slate evening sky and the shared quiet. Jedediah listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes. He just listened, his presence a solid, calming anchor. When she was finished, a profound peace settled between them. The last of her secrets were out, laid bare in the twilight. He finished his work on the rifle, setting it aside. He looked out toward the dark shape of the mountains, then gestured with his chin toward a small, fenced-off rise a short distance from the cabin. On it were two simple wooden markers, grayed by the weather. "My wife, Martha," he said, his voice thick with a grief that time had not healed. "And our daughter, Lily. A blizzard, for winter's back. I was checking the far lines. I didn't get back in time," he swallowed, the sound loud in the quiet air. "I wasn't here." The confession was stark, unadorned. It was the key to his silence, the source of his pain. He had failed to protect his own. It was why he had so fiercely protected her. Elara looked from the graves to his face, seeing the raw, suppressed agony there. Slowly, she reached out and laid her hand on his arm. The touch was light, tentative, but it was everything. His muscles bunched under her palm, and then, just as slowly, relaxed. They sat there for a long time as the stars emerged, two survivors on a lonely mountain, no longer alone in their grief. The first snows of winter fell not as a threat, but as a soft, cleansing blanket. The world outside the cabin grew white and still, and the small log structure became their entire universe. The passing of the weeks saw a slow, unobtrusive transformation. The homestead, once a bastion of solitude and sorrow, was slowly becoming a home. The daily rhythms of survival became the rhythms of a shared life. He would chop the wood, his axe strokes a steady heartbeat against the winter silence. She would cook and mend, her quiet industry filling the cabin with a sense of peace. Samuel's laughter became a common sound, a bright thread woven into the fabric of their days. He would sit by the fire, chattering to Jedediah as the big man carved, his small hands holding the wooden bird and bear as if they were priceless treasures. The empty cot where Elara and Samuel had slept was dismantled. One day, Jedediah simply built a larger, sturdier bed frame in the corner, with a thick mattress stuffed with fresh pine needles and down. He did not ask. He just built it. And that night, she and the boy slept there. The space between them and him had closed. The words came more easily now, though they were still few. They spoke of practical things: the weather, the dwindling flour sack, the tracks of a deer in the snow. But beneath the simple words, a deeper understanding grew. He learned the sound of her soft humming when she was content. She learned that the small twitch at the corner of his mouth was his version of a smile. One afternoon, he brought in a length of smooth, pale birch wood. He began to work on it in the evenings, not with the grim focus he gave his chores, but with a gentle, patient artistry. He was not carving another toy. The piece was larger, curved, its purpose slowly taking shape under his skilled hands. Alara would watch him, her heart filled with a quiet, growing warmth. This man, who had been hollowed out by grief, was slowly, carefully, building something new. He was building a life not just for himself but for them. The harshness of the wilderness remained, a constant presence outside their door. But inside, by the warmth of the reliable stove, something tender was taking root. It was a feeling as quiet and steady as the falling snow, a trust that had been earned not with grand promises, but with 1,000 small, honest gestures. They were a family, forged in silence and survival. Spring arrived as a promise kept. The cracking ice on the river sounded like a great exhalation. The deep fog of winter gave way to a pale, hopeful sun, and the first green shoots pushed their way through the thawing earth. On the first truly warm afternoon, Jedediah brought his winter's project out onto the porch. It was a small rocker, perfectly sized for a child. The birch wood sanded so smooth it shone like polished stone. He set it down near the door. He had carved the runners into the shape of sleeping bears. It was a masterpiece of quiet love. He found Alara standing by the newly opened window, breathing in the fresh air. Samuel was asleep in her arms, his head nestled against her shoulder. She was looking out at the valley, a panorama of returning life. Her face, which had been so tight with fear when she arrived, was calm now, her eyes clear. She was no longer a survivor, waiting for the next blow to fall. She was home. He came and stood beside her, not touching, but his presence was a comfort, a certainty. The silence between them was no longer a void but a shared space, rich with everything they had endured and overcome. "The trader will be in the valley next week," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We'll need flour, and cloth for a new dress for you." A proper 1 inch. She turned to look at him, a gentle, questioning look in her eyes. "This is your home now, Alara," he said, his gaze steady and direct. "If you'll have it." He didn't say the flowery words of poets. He didn't need to. The mended shoes, the wooden toys, the warm bed, the protective wall of his own body, and now this small, perfect rocker. They were a language all their own. They spoke of forever. A single tear traced a clean path through the faint dust on her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She simply nodded. She stayed. From dust and silence grew a home. From closed hearts, a family. Their story is not one of grand declarations, but of the quiet dignity of endurance, the slow, patient rebuilding of trust, and the realization that the deepest love grows not in the spotlight, but in the gentle, steady shadows of shared daily life, where no one else is looking. If the story touched you, like warm light in a cold night, then carry it with you. Remember that strength is often quietest, and the most profound connections are built not on words, but on the simple, honest gesture of a hand reached out in the dark. True sanctuary is not a place, but a person. Subscribe to our channel for more stories full of silence, courage, and genuine closeness. And tell us what moved you the most. We'll see you again, where silence means home.